Unknown persons at the door. Walter Willoughby always made sure his apartment door was locked. Even when he was home, unknown persons would come to the door and check the lock to see if they could get in. So Walter always kept the door locked, even while home. The door was mostly a window, and Walter saw the unknown persons' various silhouettes blossomed by the light in the hall. Went the persons checking the lock on the door to see if they could get in. They couldn't. And then when Walter left to go out and about, he'd check the door too, repeatedly, to make sure they couldn't get in while he was out. So, for example, he'd be checking to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked, and then checking the lock again to make sure he'd just then check the lock, and also to make sure the door was locked. 7 times, for example, was a good number of checkings, since 7 can be anyone's lucky number, even Walter's. He checked if the door was locked, and the unknown persons checked if it was not, almost like a transaction. Sometimes halfway down the block from the apartments, Walter would turn and go back and check the door lock 3 more times just to be extra sure. Locked, 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 he'd murmur, twisting the glass knob. 3 is also, of course, renowned as a lucky number. Walter mused about the unknown persons who always wanted in. If they really wanted in, why didn't they just break the window in the door? If he could keep them out just by making sure the door was locked, then fuck those idiots. But what did they want in the end, anyhow? Did they want his stereo? Did they want to pee on his bed? Did they want to put germs in his underwear that would make his penis fall off? Did they want his girlfriend's phone number since she was much too pretty for Walter? Did they want what little money Walter had? It was always money, Walter would say to himself. And then, as he'd sit there saying something to himself to that effect, a shadow would blossom in the window, in the door, and an unknown person would check the lock to see if they could get in. And then the shadow would pause in dissatisfaction, and then they would go away. And Walter would think, maybe they just want me. And then he'd think, but they can't all be women, and anyway, I'm not that sexy. And then he'd laugh. And then he'd think, but then why do they want me if they do want me? And then he'd think, maybe they want me for a fight. And then he'd think, well, why don't they just ask and I'll tell them I'm a pacifist? And then Walter would think, well, if it isn't that they want me for a fight, why can't they do to someone else or with someone else what they want to do to me or with me? And then he'd think, that's a good question for them. They have to eat. Then he'd start thinking about what he wanted to eat. Walter Willoughby wrecked. Bottom line, in his finest moments, clearest thoughts. Someday he would simply hide behind the door and just leave it unlocked, and he'd be holding some kind of a club, and he'd wait it out. Yeah! He'd get like a caveman's club with a bent rusty nail sticking out of it. Then let those unknown person motherfuckers try his fucking doorknob! Would they be surprised? The end.